The more evidence, the better, I say.
I mean, this is so improbable.
That's a bold statement.
I mean, I think that's a fair point, but I didn't make that argument. He did.
Why is that true? Is that a good question? Maybe it's not.
Drew, you're not supposed to ask good questions like
sorry,
that.
sorry,
Don't ask difficult questions.
Bill, jump in here.
I'm Bill the Christian.
And I'm Drew the Skeptic.
You're listening to The Divide. All right, well, welcome to The Divide. We're here today with John from Atlanta, who's an atheist. I think, John, is that right? You'd say you're an atheist?
Yes, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so we're going to be hearing his story today and sort of his, I guess, autobiographical religious journey. And then eventually we're going to talk about his role as an officiator of weddings and funerals, secular weddings and funerals, and how they might be different from traditional ones. So we look forward to having that part of the conversation. So John, why don't you start us off with, sort of how you were brought up and what your sort of religious journey has been.
Okay. Well, again, thanks for having me on. So I was raised in Kentucky in the 60s and 70s in the Southern Baptist tradition. Had the the so-called conversion experience when I was 8. Joined the church when I was 8, and then when I was, I guess my journey toward atheism would be when I was a teenager. I was given a Bible for I think it was a Christmas present, but it was a Schofield Reference Bible, if you're familiar with those.
Oh yeah,
yeah. So it's a Bible that has some historical information in it, some scholarly commentary, and that kind of thing. So, being a very bookish kid, I started reading my Bible and studying it, and I would run into the occasional comment that would say stuff like, the book of Genesis is attributed to Moses. But, of course, you go to church and they tell you flat out that Moses wrote it. So I'm like, attributed to? Wait a minute, I don't quite understand that. And then there would be a footnote that would say something like, the exact meaning of this word is not known. And I would think, well, wait a minute, this is supposed to be the eternal and unambiguous word of God. And how could it be, that they don't know what this word means? And so it started to have little seeds of doubt, or inevitably in the New Testament, when they would have the verses that talked about Jesus rising from the dead, there would be a footnote that would say these verses do not appear in the earliest known manuscripts. And I'm thinking, hang on a second. So by the time
can I ask you a quick
Can
I ask you a quick question about that just before we go on?
Sure.
Maybe you didn't have a thought about this at that age or whatever, but what did you think of the author of the Schofield Bible, like the Schofield guy? Were you thinking, hey, this guy's a heretic compared to the people I'm in church with? Or did you not really think like that?
I guess at the time, the whole idea of keep in mind that when you're 14, 15, you have no idea what the depth of biblical scholarship has been, and you really don't know what all the discussions and debates have been surrounding the Bible. You just, or the history of the Middle East, etc. You just, nothing. So when I get this Bible, I just think, oh, it's an additional resource, somebody that knows what they're talking about. Of course, now when I look back at it, I realize that Schofield was really pretty faithful. In other words, his commentary is not as scathing as it could be, given things that I know now, or the opinions that I've heard from other people. But at the time, I didn't really know what to make of it. I just thought, well, this is interesting that there's controversy over the meaning of a word, or excuse me, or that there were facts in dispute, or that the origins. For example, in the New Testament, a lot of the letters are attributed to various people, but when you read the little scholarly footnotes, it'll tell you that they really don't know who wrote them. So and of course that
because Schofield was pretty conservative, right? Like
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
theologically, I think he'd pretty much be like the sort of beliefs that were in tension
Yeah.
when you were seeing his notes. He still held all those beliefs, but it's interesting that you were not hearing that come through like in your like. I wonder if you were hearing that from whatever your parents or people at the church or whatever, if it would have just been like, oh yeah, I've already heard all this.
It was all new.
I don't know. I remember reading. I remember seeing things in the Bible growing up as a Christian, where I would ask my parents about it or my Sunday school teacher or whoever, and it could be as simple as literally in any version of the Bible. You see that in the Gospels, this passage did not appear in the earliest manuscripts. And I always found that nobody had a really great answer. Not to throw my parents or anyone else under the bus, but it was just
Yeah.
like, oh yeah, scholars debate that, and there's still scholars that are Christians. Maybe 10% of them or whatever that are the New Testament historians. But so don't worry about it. It doesn't mean you have to lose your faith. And that was kind of, listen, this is probably, I'm indicting myself for lack of study, but as a Christian, it was always a matter of there was a point where the inquiry ended, and I just couldn't get any further, and I had to I had this verse that I would always quote from, I think it's Psalm 131:1. I do not concern myself with things too wonderful for me. And I would just go back to that.
Yeah.
So I totally get sort of where you're coming from of like, oh, we don't really get the answers to this stuff at church.
Right.
That's a good point. Sorry, go ahead, John.
No, I was just going to say, don't get me wrong. I don't want to give the impression that the moment I started reading this Schofield Reference Bible that everything went under the bus. This was more of a case of I just started to see a little more gray to, a little more subtlety to things, a little more ambiguity, but it is interesting that even, I'm sure to this day that Southern Baptist ministers do not teach anything about the historical, critical aspects of the Bible in Sunday school, or much less from the pulpit. And certainly we never heard anything like that from the pulpit. But I would say by the time I got to college, I would still have considered myself a Christian. It's just I was questioning when I would hear people say things like, the Bible is inerrant, or the Bible is, has the answers to everything. It's clear that the people in the Bible had no idea that evolution occurred, or anything about how the solar system operated or any of that stuff, which is not a theological question. It just shows that the Bible is, of course, it's many, many books all wrapped into one, but it's not trying to do everything. It's trying to do very specific things. Yeah,
this is a very good point. And Drew also making a great point that there's sort of a difference between being told we're not quite certain who wrote this book.
Yeah.
Is not necessarily some great theological tension, right, with the Nicene Creed. But there's other things like the Bible's inerrant, but we don't know if this story's in the Bible.
Right.
That would then create tension. Like that's obviously as you get into college and stuff, you're seeing the gray is not just gray. There's actual real tension there.
Right. Well, I forget which book of the Bible it is. One of the early New Testament, one of the early Old Testament books that is attributed to Moses, but Moses dies before the end of the book, and it says God buried his body in a hidden place or something like that. I don't remember the exact wording. But I remember reading that going, oh, wait a minute. How could Moses have written this book if he dies 2/3 of the way through it? So there was clearly some ambiguity, some levels of gray, as I said before. And that sort of got me thinking a little bit about, okay, what do I really believe? Am I a full hardcore Southern Baptist, or am I more of a general, Christian of some kind, So when I got to college, I would say still definitely, I would say a born again Christian. Even if I was prepared to discuss certain aspects of the Bible, if it came up, not like it really came up on a normal, everyday basis, but
yeah. So this one of the things I'm aware of, because of course I've been on the academic side, right? I did classics, which is not really Bible, but Bible was part of the classics department. But the professors were not like evangelical Christians, and so I was hearing all this in university while I was a nascent Christian, a very very young Christian, and sort of hearing all that for the first time. And I do recall interacting with some of the Christian academics out beyond the university I was in, and they were sort of lamenting that there wasn't more educating going on of Christians in the churches about sort of what's sort of the real academic situation with the Bible on some things, like the story of the adulterous woman having some question as to whether it's original and stuff. And so when people were hearing that for the first time, that was very troubling to them, and they didn't think it needed to be, but some things like that anyways didn't need to be, and so they were kind of lamenting that there's not more of this educating going on. But of course the Bible itself, if you're reading the Gospels and you're teaching the Gospels, it's not like the Gospels are focused on that, like unless you want to spend an entire day just talking about the background to that book as a book kind of a thing, or its history. You could do 6 Sunday school lessons just on the Gospel of Matthew, its history and
Yeah.
authorship, all that kind of stuff. But most people aren't going to church to hear these long academic lectures, so it just tends not to be a focus, I think.
Right. Yeah. No, I would agree.
So then, John, so you left college essentially as still sort of identifying as a Christian, I guess, or still?
Well, at high school
Seeing
for
yourself as a
sure.
Christian?
When it was
Or high
interesting.
school, yeah.
High school. But when I went to college, that was when you have to remember, I grew up in a rural community. Everybody was Christian. We had, I think, the one guy that was not a Christian was the guy that owned the grocery store was Jewish, but everybody else was Christian. There were enough Catholics to have one little Catholic church, which we saw as an anomaly. But, Methodist, Christian, Baptist, all those denominations were well represented. But I get to college, and I started to meet people that were Muslim, Jewish, Hindus, and atheists, people who had grown up within 50 miles of me, who I was flabbergasted to discover had literally never set foot in a church, which just seemed completely unbelievable to me that a Kentuckian, somebody from central Kentucky, could have grown up and never been to church. It just blew my mind. So by the time I got out of college, I would say I was kind of more of a Unitarian. I would describe it as Unitarian now. I wouldn't, how do you say this? I wasn't a Unitarian, like a member of the Unitarian Church, but I was somebody that...
De facto Unitarian.
Yeah, I sort of was like, this thing about the Trinity seems a little weird, and the Bible is, I think very flawed, and it's an attempt to get at the truth. But I still think that if you're a good person and you believe in God and you try your best, that you'll go to heaven. You don't necessarily have to be baptized and in the Southern Baptist Church and all this sort of thing. I would flag that as a pretty huge step. I think maybe the distance from fundamentalism to a sort of liberal Unitarian faith is maybe even bigger than the step from there to atheism for some people. Depends how fundamental your fundamentalism really was, I suppose. But I do think that's a really interesting thing to note, that it took all of college to get that far, and in some of high school. So totally makes sense to me, coming from a fairly conservative, sometimes Baptist upbringing. Yeah.
So
now I will say
pretty identifiable.
One of the interesting things that happened to me when I was in college is I was an engineer, studied electrical engineering in college, and we had to take technical writing. Basically, it's an English class, but they call it technical writing. And my technical writing professor was a guy named Joe Nickel, who is a world-famous skeptic. He's worked with the Center for Scientific Inquiry for decades. He's been on like all the like Jerry Springer and shows like that. They'll bring him on as sort of the token skeptic to beat on. But he's written a lot of books about, haunted houses. When I knew him, he had just written a book about the Shroud of Turin. He had worked with a team of people that wanted to investigate the Shroud of Turin from a historical and scientific perspective. And I mean, I had no idea what a skeptic was, or any notion of what skeptical investigation was, or any of that stuff. But the fact that I had a professor who was involved in this stuff and writing books about it and magazine articles and all that kind of intrigued me, and it sort of opened up again a little bit more of a perspective to the world that like when I was a kid, I would read Erich von Däniken, Chariots of the Gods, and books about UFOs and alien abductions, and I would more or less take it at face value, like, wow, these people are... But then you start to read some of the skeptical analysis of this, and you realize that there's a lot of psychology, a lot of, other things going on, and not to mention people can just outright lie about things. So it sort of gave me a little bit of a glimpse into the skeptical mindset. So yeah, by the time I got out of college, I would say, still Christian, but not quite as married to the exact, the disciplines of the Southern Baptist denomination.
And doctrines and...
Right.
Can I say something about a
sure.
professor in college? Oh,
yeah, go ahead.
You just reminded me of something that I hadn't thought about for quite a while, is how influential this was for me, because again, I was a very young Christian. I was just learning Greek and Latin and not reading Bible, just reading Plato and the tragedians and stuff. And but I had a professor who was the president of the Atheist Club. Like there was a student Atheist Club, and he was the faculty liaison or advisor or whatever for the club. And it was pretty vocal about his atheism. And I took a class with him on mythology, and which I thought would be really cool class. And it was very interesting. But he took one night. He told us he was going to show the relationships between classical mythology and the Gospels accounts of Jesus.
Okay.
And I thought, oh boy, here it comes. Like I was already aware as a Christian who had been an atheist. I was like, okay, I think I kind of know where this is going to go. And I was sort of a little worried about how that was, just what that was going to mean. Would I feel overwhelmed by this, like evidence or whatever? And so he took about an hour and a half, and he went through about 22 or 23 parallels between classical myths and the story of Jesus, and which I thought was all very interesting for sure.
Yeah.
And then I remember we had a break, and I remember thinking, I'm really looking forward to the contrasts, and then how he's going to summarize all this. And that was it. He never did anything else with it. He didn't go on to like the other side of the coin of like what was different. Mm-hmm. It's obviously huge differences between the parallels. And so I remember just leaving that night thinking, that was he seemed so confident that he had made this case. He was yeah. pretty energized about it, you can imagine, And he felt so confident about the case he had made. I just remember thinking, like just basic academic 101 here, you got to go on to what's different as well. And then you have
sure.
to analyze it, like there's other steps here. And I remember that kind of left an impression on me that like, I guess he didn't have a very good case. And of course, it's not that I think all of atheism doesn't have anything to say about this. It's just that night really left an impression on me. And that class, as a result of that, I always kind of had an impression like he wasn't very formidable,
Yeah.
It sounds pretty motivated. It's hard to take it seriously when it's clearly, sort of skewed one direction.
Yeah.
So nice to get. I'm always trying to see things from as many sides as possible. The bull case and the bear case, so to speak.
Yeah.
For everything. So, I'm kind of with you, Bill, on that would sort of take my respect, I guess, for a professor down a peg to get a one-sided case like that.
Had the reverse effect. And I was thinking about the sort of tradition within the Protestant, like the whole Protestant tradition is a sort of red pill right? Like they came out of the Matrix and saw the truth that was corrupted by the church leadership, and so, and ever since then, there's this feeling in the Protestant world, at the core of it, that they discovered what was right, what is correct, and being correct is like the premier virtue. That everything, they're the ones who are right. They have to be right, because if they're not right, then that would be devastating, because that's what I guess historically created them. And I say that as I'm a Protestant, but I'm just saying I sort of get that feeling, and I'm a Protestant, but I've come into the church, like I was on the outside, and when I was real young, my family was Catholic. When I was my dad's side was all Catholic, but I didn't grow up going to Catholic church regularly after my parents' divorce. But it was, so I do sort of feel like I have that's sort of a true observation on the way the psyche is in the sort of Protestant evangelical conservative wing. Anyway, go ahead, carry on, John, if you want to keep going. And what happened after that?
Well, let's see. So I would say after I got out of college, it wasn't very long after that I just there was no particular thing or moment or event or anything, but at some point I just thought, I don't really believe this stuff. I kind of kept ratcheting myself back. It's like, well, the Bible's not inerrant. That's fine. There's really no reason to think that, this and that. And so at one point I just thought, I'm just hanging on to, as Julia Sweeney would say, just a teaspoon of truth. I'm trying to swallow this whole matrix of baloney to get to, one little thing. And at one point I just thought, I don't believe this stuff. So I just, moved on. And I spent several years just not really being active in anything one way or the other. But when I moved to Atlanta, I guess in my mid-20s, and wasn't too long after I moved to Atlanta, I guess I must have been here 4 or 5 years, I saw, back when we had newspapers, I saw in the newspaper that there was this man going to be speaking at something called the Atlanta Free Thought Society. And I thought, well, what is this about? And so the news article said that he was a juror who had been put on the jury for some guy named Judge Roy Moore in Alabama. And probably your listeners will know who Judge Roy Moore is now, but at the time he was just some two-bit.
Well, our listeners are international, John. What do you mean?
Yeah, exactly. So
I'm just joking.
Yeah, but so I'm like Judge Roy Moore, and I thought, I remember hearing something in the news about this judge who insisted on having not just a prayer but a Southern Baptist prayer before the jury would go back for deliberations, and that he hung this wooden plaque with the 10 Commandments in the courtroom, et cetera, et cetera. And there was this guy it turned out he was an engineer, had objected to this, and that's how he'd gotten into the paper. So I just thought, this might be an interesting thing to go see. I had no idea that there was any such thing as an Atlanta Free Thought Society or American Atheist. I mean, I guess I'd heard of Madalyn Murray O'Hair, but just the notion that there would be a social organization of like that was a novelty to me. But anyway, so I go to see this guy give his talk, and the very first person I laid eyes on when I walked in was a guy that I worked with. So, and I had no idea that we were both basically sort of in the secret atheist club. So then I started, hanging out with the Atlanta Free Thought Society, and got to know a lot of people there. And for a while, I was in the leadership of the Atlanta Free Thought Society, and so at some point, and for a long time, I will say this too, to get into politics, for a long time, I kind of voted Republican because I thought, I like the idea of lower taxes. I like the idea of less regulation. In my youth, I was a bit of a libertarian. And so I thought, these people, they keep talking about Jesus and prayer in the schools, and they're never going to make any of that happen. The courts are never going to allow any of that stuff. So they can pray all they want as long as they lower my taxes. But then they started to get into office, and I realized, you know what? They're really not interested in the lower taxes thing. They're more interested in the ethical, moral, control.
You've noticed that, have you?
Yeah. So there was a period where I kind of, I would vote Libertarian kind of as a protest vote, and then at some point I realized, the Libertarians are just Republicans who don't want to say they're Republicans. So screw that bunch. And so I've, at a certain point, I sort of became more activist, and started.
How old were you about this time?
Well, let's see. I would have been
Roughly.
late 30s.
Okay. Were you, if I may just go back one step, when
Sure.
you were, you said you had sort of a teaspoon left,
Yeah.
or you were
Right.
you were sort of swallowing this. You were like, why swallow all of this when I just want there's just a teaspoon out of this?
Mm-hmm.
What did you mean by the teaspoon? Well, what's in the teaspoon?
Oh, I guess, at some point I just was sort of, as I mentioned before, you might describe me as almost Unitarian Universalist, even though I never was affiliated with that group. Just the idea that there was a higher power. If you were a good person and there was a heaven, you would go to heaven. That there was something out there. That was really it. Just just the kernel of the notion that maybe there was something life after death or something like that. And be honest with you.
So when you were in Atlanta,
Yeah.
sorry.
No, that phase did not last very long. So
Okay. So, because I was going to say, when you went to Atlanta and saw this free thought sort of advert,
yeah.
at that point, was there still sort of a teaspoon in there
No.
of something, or not really?
No, at that point I would have
And was there-
definitely self-identified as an atheist. Yeah.
Okay.
Was there? Did you at that, like during that phase? I guess if I want to say that, however long that was, what you had mentioned that professor, from university.
Yeah.
But was there a book you were, because it wasn't YouTube back then, I guess. So
No.
was there a book or some anybody that was influencing you, or just sort of like in your own mind as you're just away from religion, it just gets weirder and weirder the farther you away.
Yeah, I guess
you are away from it or something?
at that time period there wasn't really a lot of. I mean, clearly there were some books out, like Carl Sagan had written. Was it Candle in the Dark, or I can't remember the name of the book now, but Demon Haunted World. Demon Haunted World.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
and but there weren't. I mean, and Madeline Murray O'Hare had published a few books that I was not aware of at the time. So I would say, I wasn't really influenced by any, atheist apologetics, for lack of a better term. There was really very little of that. But once, of course, I discovered organizational atheism, secular groups, and started to hear about, oh, you should read this guy or that guy. And honestly, very little of it was anything new to me. I mean, I already knew that, for example, evolution was real. I already had a pretty good grasp on the age of the universe and stuff like that. So a lot of it was just more hearing more different kinds of arguments, but nothing. I would say nothing revelatory at that point. And you have to keep in mind, too, living in the South, sorry to interrupt, but living in the South, it was generally not a good idea to go around blabbing that you were, back in the 80s and 90s, generally speaking, it was not a good thing to say anything. Because I can remember speaking to somebody at the office, I forgot now even what it was we were talking about, somebody in the news, and they said, they kind of leaned forward and said, yeah, it's not like they're an atheist. And they kind of like looked left and right, like they didn't even want to say the word. And I remembered thinking, well, you're speaking to one, but I just kept my mouth shut.
So Trump supporters, the new atheism, then.
Trump
Can't
supporters.
talk about it.
Oh well, in a way,
people don't want to admit they're a
People
Trump
don't.
supporter, or voter or something. I remember evolution, by the way, being such a big thing, at least in my, like in the 80s when I was young, that was a big, like, I guess, access point. Because there wasn't, like, I don't remember ever, like, reading philosophers or thinking, hey, I ought to read some philosophers on this question about God,
Sure.
I didn't know any other than the ancient ones, and and I did start reading the Bible when I was interested, and I realized if you're already like encased in the Bible, it's sort of like I already know this. Although I'm not sure people know as much as they think, but they feel like they do anyway. You know, they sort of feel like they do. So there's not like a big drive. Like I had a huge drive when I started getting curious about Christianity to really want to read these texts, and I was reading them as someone that knew very, very little about
Right.
any of the. I'd never like actually gone and like read the Bible when I was young, or heard the Bible read like in a way that was anything other than just window dressing accessory here, wallpaper around the room once in a while in a church service.
Right.
So evolution was a big thing of like discussion, you know, on TV and in the of like it was almost like you're either a Christian or you're an evolutionist, which meant you were an atheist. You know, that was sort of the feel of it. It's
Yeah.
not that way anymore now. I would say I teach at a university, a Christian university, Baptist university, you know, Samford, and there's I would say probably the majority of the students, I would, if I had to guess, probably think evolution is true at some large level. Maybe not every single thing about evolution,
Yeah.
and I also think most of them don't think it rules out theism or Christianity or something. But back then, that was a big sort of, debate. Anyway, I was just curious about that, like moment of sort of the change. So after you then, once you're in like a community with atheists, right, and you get
Yeah.
into that community, do you feel like then you start? Do you get energized more about your atheism and start to feel a little more like you start reading more books or start getting more educated in a way about atheism itself and against Christianity or something? Or
And maybe just so we don't make this 2 hours long, if you could fast forward to the part where you get involved with doing weddings and
Oh, sure.
funerals. I think that's really
Yeah.
going to be an interesting. Just if that does tie in to Bill's question, which sounds
Yeah.
like it would.
Yeah,
if-
sure.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, obviously, yes. When I became involved in organized atheist groups, you just naturally. They had a library at the AFS meeting place, and you would hear references to different people. And of course, it's interesting. You go back and read people like Robert Green Ingersoll, who was a 19th century orator, a Republican no less. And you read some of the stuff that all his writings and lectures are available. You start to read the stuff that he said 125 years ago, and it's like same stuff. You know, it's people talk about the new atheism, and it's like there's nothing new about the new atheism except that we happen to get a spate of people that were very good writers and very good debaters who were not, they were willing to kind of get in the scrum. You know, that's the only thing new about them. I mean, they would have no significant differences of opinion, for example, with Madalyn Murray O'Hair, or even Robert Green Ingersoll for that matter. But at any rate, yeah, at some point I started, this would have been in 2007, so however many years ago that was, I started at the time it was a blog, American Free Thought, which is still around, AmericanFreeThought.com. But not long after that, I started doing a podcast with a friend of mine named David Driscoll. And he and I did this podcast together for 10 years or more. I forget exactly when it was that he got busy with his professional life and had to bow out. But I have sort of continued it off and on to the present day. And interviewed, lots and lots of authors and activists, and it's been very interesting. But yes, part of the you're mentioning the thing about being an officiant, however you pronounce it. The American Humanist Association, which I'm also a member of, there's a sort of an extension of that group called the Humanist Society, that offers a sort of a certification as a secular officiant or humanist officiant to do weddings and funerals. So, and really, there are other things. I've never done it, but there are some people that do like naming ceremonies or baby welcoming ceremonies, and a lot of them are sort of analogs to things that religious people would be well familiar with. But
like a christening or a baptism or
Yeah, instead of a christening, it would just be a sort of a thing to say we're welcoming this new baby to the world, and here are her parents, and they're pledging to raise her, as a good person, to be good role models, but it's all very, So I've never done that myself, but I know people who have, and you can do that also as a humanist celebrant, and a lot of this stuff with the humanist celebrant has to do with the way. Either the way state laws are organized or the way county clerks and people like that view marriage certificates. So if it's signed by somebody that's not the pastor of the First Methodist Church, then there are questions, because there are people who think that you have to get married in a church or by a judge, So
has that changed in the past several years, or is it still that way?
I think the laws are all. The law allows for it. It's just there's a perception, there's a kickback, there's sort of a lack of a better term, a bigotry toward secular weddings and that sort of thing. When my wife and I got married, for example, this was back in 2006. We wanted to get married in a private ceremony. We didn't want to get married in a church. We didn't want to get married by anybody affiliated with a religious organization. But we were lucky that a friend of ours was a county judge. So she was able to do the ceremony for us in her capacity as a judge. So we had a private dinner at this nice restaurant, private room, and she wrote a nice secular ceremony, and it, we had immediate family, and it all was great. So then fast forward some years, I had a niece who wanted to get married, and they were up in Kentucky, but they also didn't want to get married in a religious setting or by someone representing a religious organization. And at that time, my wife was like, you know what? You've been talking about becoming a celebrant through the Humanist Society. You ought to go ahead and do that. So I did, and there's a process. You fill out a form and you give them your, kind of like what we've been talking about, what your life has been like and how you got to where you were and why you're a humanist and so forth. And they have resources, examples of ceremonies, scripts, and so forth that you can use. But a lot of times I just write my own thing. So I did her wedding, my niece's wedding, as a humanist celebrant, which of course was a minor controversy in my family, because I had some family members that sort of privately were like, what's this all about, and they were like, oh, you're pushing it in our face, you're shoving this down our throats, and it's like, well, wait a minute, I'm not telling you that Jesus isn't real. I'm not saying anything about it. In other words, you don't go to a religious wedding expecting the preacher to tell you why atheism is wrong. They're just presenting the wedding based on their belief system and wishing the couple good luck, and so it's no different. So a secular wedding.
A deafening silence, John. It was a deafening silence.
Yeah. So, and I had one person that asked me, they're like, "Is this legal?" Because people just don't know what the laws say. And like in Georgia, it basically says that credentials notwithstanding, if the couple that's getting married recognizes the authority of the person performing the ceremony, they are considered legally married. So that way, even if somebody came back later, and I can't think of a good example. Let's say I lied to them and told them I was a Baptist minister, and then they found out later that I wasn't. They might just say, well, that's okay. We recognize your authority to marry us, and so we're still married. And nobody could come back later and say, you're not really married because this person didn't have the proper credentials,
I suppose
that's comforting for Georgians, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's different everywhere, though.
I suppose it's not just because of a lack of sort of a religious Jesus element, but also because on TV, when you're doing a wedding that's not like a church wedding, the default assumption is you're going to the courthouse
Yeah.
where someone has legal authority to marry you.
Yeah.
So for someone just showing up and you're at you're in a backyard or whatever.
Yeah.
Someone's like, wait, or at the beach, someone's like, wait, this is even legal? So I
Yeah.
suppose they come by that somewhat innocently.
Right. Yeah.
I guess
And
I've thought this was more of a thing for, going back quite a while. Like I remember, was it Joey that married Rachel or Ross and somebody on some Friends,
Yeah.
back in the 90s, something. So it was like one of the friends married the other two friends, or I don't remember the
Right.
exact
True.
details.
If you're gonna use a popular sitcom reference, it has to be to a very high quality sitcom like Seinfeld.
This
Yeah,
is
there you
also
go.
None of us
very
know
popular.
about Friends. None of us know about Friends.
This is a total a new show that you might not have heard of called Friends.
yeah. Yeah. Well, it is interesting that, there are people who they'll go to the Moonies or something, the Universalist Church, I forget what it's called, and you can just pay $50 and they'll pretty much send anybody a certificate. And I didn't want to do that because I'm not religious and I don't want to be representing myself in any way as being associated with a religion. So the fact that the Humanist Society, which is even though it's not a religious organization in the sense of having a supernatural belief, it's a religious organization in the sense of the way our current laws and tax laws and so forth are structured, having to do with quote unquote churches. It's an ethical organization with a belief system, set of ethical rules, et cetera, et cetera. So we meet all the criteria of a church minus the actual supernatural aspect. So the fact that you can get it's not really a license. What do they call it? They don't call it a certification. Anyway, you do get a piece of paper that shows that you're, duly
Licensed,
authorized by them to do these ceremonies, and you can sign the marriage certificate and so forth. And I only had one time where some county clerk gave the bride, when she took it to the courthouse, she gave her some kickback. Well, I don't recognize what this is and blah, blah, blah. So I had to go call the judge that was in charge of that particular county and explain what was going on. And she completely knew what I was talking about from the get-go and said, don't worry, we'll take care of it. And, that was that. So, and then I did go ahead.
Well, I think you're about to say, maybe I was about to ask about the funeral. I mean, you
Right.
you can think of sort of like when a baby comes into the world, sort of having some ceremony around that, and the
Sure.
wedding, obviously having some ceremony around that is like very natural things to do, whether there's a religious slant on it or not.
Sure.
And then a funeral, obviously, is a very significant thing for a family and a person.
Can I ask a question or two about weddings before
Sure.
we do the funerals?
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
Is that okay? And then, one question I have is, I know there'll be some people, and it doesn't matter whether you think it's fair because you'll know what I mean when I ask this, is there'll be some people who are Christians that'll say, well, isn't he just doing like religion still by doing this?
Yeah.
What do you
isn't
mean?
this just basic?
What
Well,
do you mean?
I really mean this. I don't mean to say this as if I'm convinced this is a good question. I'm just telling you, I know
Yeah.
there'll be Christians who think, well, aren't doing like weddings with a officiant and so on, or doing christening of babies and stuff, isn't that just kind of like religion? Like, and in fact, there may even be atheists who say, why are we doing this? This is just like religion smuggled into atheism.
Right.
So what's your response to that? I'm sure you've
Well,
heard that at some point.
sure. I mean, I guess I could point out that the Christians are mimicking the ceremonies of pagan Rome by having weddings and marriages. They're mimicking the ceremonies of the Vikings, of the Nordic. I mean, every culture has had some version of marriage, and it's even in America, ultimately marriage is a legal construct. You can go get married in the Catholic Church if you want to, but if you do not get a certificate signed by witnesses and turned in to your local county clerk or whatever it is, you are not married. It does not matter what Jesus thinks. you are not married unless you are married legally. So, I mean, I agree that there are people who don't like the idea of marriage because it maybe there is in some circles a Christian notion of marriage being this thing ordained by God, and that the man is the head of the household, and all this stuff. Which, if that's your bag, great. But the bottom line is that marriage is and always has been a cultural institution that provides security to people, legal security, societal security, home, their homes and so forth. My wife and I are married because we want the legal benefits of insurance and survivorship. And if something happens to me and I have to have somebody make medical decisions, I have less paperwork to do if I'm married than if not. If we had children, if you're married, obviously things are much more straightforward from a legal standpoint, financial standpoint. So there's all sorts of secular reasons to be married that have nothing to do with Christianity. So,
Yeah.
It's,
I think this, by the way, if I just may say to Christians for Christians that are listening, I would just say I think it's a really good answer to say it's a deep human instinct. It's a long human tradition, well before that predates Jesus, that there were weddings and ceremonies with officiants and things like this, because it's just it's a sort of a natural instinct. It's not just now they were mainly religious, but I mean still it's a deep human instinct. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And as a skeptic, I will even agree with that last line that they were in some way religious, but obviously not always, as you said, Christian, because some of them predate Jesus, but and certainly still some in areas that are not even industrialized, and I'm sure they have their own unique ways of marking these events. And that was the question I was trying to get to, is you have birth, you have marriage, you have death. There's probably a few other events worth marking, but when there's a sort of a search for meaning aspect to this, right? It's you're trying to mark these significant things. And the question I was getting to a minute ago was, the funeral to me seems the hardest for the skeptic or the atheist to, like, I want to know how that goes, because I've not had experience with that, and it is sort of the comfort of believing that there is an afterlife and you'll see this person again is always part of funerals that I've been to, and I would honestly like to hear sort of how that can be sort of extricated from the event.
Sure. Yeah. Well. Let me just say, I've only done, in all the weddings I only did one actual funeral, and it was because on the handful of other occasions that people had contacted me, I couldn't do it for schedule. There was one, I was literally packing my bags to go to the airport to go to Japan. My phone rings, and it's some poor man whose son had died, and he was trying to organize a funeral, and I just couldn't do it because I was literally going to be out of country for a week. But yes, it's true that if you're secular and or atheist, whatever you want to call it, humanist, you don't, the aspect of hope beyond this life does not come into play. So the focus is really more on allowing people to grieve the person that they're going to miss, to allow people to look at the positive aspects that, we had this person in our midst for a period of time, and they added to our lives and gave us love and comfort and companionship, whatever it is. So there's plenty of positive aspects that can be focused on without talking about, we hope to see them someday in the future sort of thing. But it was interesting, the one funeral that I did, excuse me, when I was speaking to the widow, who tell me about this guy, and they said, well, he sold collectible books, and I'm like, oh, really? What what kind of books did they say? And they said, well, it was mostly science fiction and fantasy. I'm like, really? And they said, oh yeah, he used to go to Dragon Con all the time. Well, Dragon Con is a big pop culture convention that's held here in Atlanta every year for the last 30 years or something. And years ago, I published an online science fiction magazine, and I would go to Dragon Con all the time to cover it and participate in panels and so forth. So it turns out I actually had met the guy, like in the dealer's room. Just, I didn't know him well, but just I knew who he was. So the interesting thing was that when they told me that was his thing, he was really big into science fiction and fantasy, then I started to look up quotes from classic science fiction about death or about life. And there's lots and lots of quotes, Star Trek, Star Wars, etc. And so I was able to write a little sort of a eulogy that tied into some of the concepts of things that he would have known about, things that would have been very familiar to him. And we structured it so that family and friends could, stand up or come up to the lectern, whatever they wanted to do, and talk about their memories of this person, and so forth. So, I'm not saying I'm some great orator, but people seem to be very happy with it, and it didn't, in my opinion, seem to be in any way, weak tea compared to a religious funeral.
Yeah, no, that resonates with me quite a bit. Just to sort of focus on the positive. I think that's kind of important, and to have a chance to both grieve and yet remember the good things, for the family and the ones that were close to the person who's died. I mean, that's typically sort of how I view funerals now, anyway. And some of the it's a little bit difficult to sit through sometimes. Some of the when the emphasis is placed on we'll see this person again, it's a little like, well, let's I don't know, it can be disappointing to me to not focus on the reality of what we know and what we had and what we enjoyed about the person. So that totally makes sense to me, and I could see that. I've just never experienced a funeral like that.
Well, and the other thing. Let me just say that not to throw Christians under the bus, but here we go. Now, it was interesting that in the few when I've been involved both in weddings and in funerals, but the wedding particularly, the widow said, now so and so's brother is going to be there, and he is a fundamentalist Christian, and I don't know if he's going to say anything, but he might, disruptive or contrary to the central message of the memorial, but he might. And I thought, you know what? I have never, not once in the hundreds and thousands of funerals that I've either been to or heard about, I've never heard of an atheist disrupting a funeral to say that's a bunch of baloney. But this one, it's such a novelty to people that there is, and my wife and I went to a memorial not that long ago where it turns out that the woman who had died was not a believer, and she had been very active in Democratic politics here in Metro Atlanta back in the 50s and 60s and 70s. You want to talk about a lonely club. But when during the eulogy, her daughter talked about how she was active with women's rights and this and that and the other, and how she used to have separation of church and state parties where people would dress as famous patriots and stuff like that. But then the woman's sister, who was very religious, insisted on singing a couple of hymns as part of the funeral service. So it was this very schizophrenic thing, where you're getting one message here and then all of a sudden you're getting another one. And you knew for a fact that the woman who had died did not want hymns sung at her funeral. But yet that's where they went. And, what are you going to do? You can't have a big argument with people at the funeral. You have to let them say their piece, and, you go on.
I suppose that both weddings and funerals, there's a lot that just naturally parallels, regardless of someone's religious sentiment, because the person had value to the people around them, so you're naturally going to celebrate their life. In the case of a funeral, in the case of weddings, who doesn't celebrate people that are, they're in love and all the excitement and all that kind of stuff. So there's sort of just a natural parallel to some things. I was thinking that just listening to this, that what stands out to me about the Christian traditional ceremonies. Okay, obviously a lot of people now do all sorts of non-traditional stuff, just like churches are constantly non-traditional. But the traditional weddings, across the history of Christianity, or funerals, are more, I think of them more as opportunities for the officiants to sort of reinforce through the event. In addition to all the other stuff you're doing, you're reinforcing the unique Christian worldview. So you're, in the case of the wedding, it's a promise like that these two people make to each other that's binding, and they won't abandon one another till death, because they represent Jesus' love for his church, and it's binding. And so there's a lot of taking the ceremony and using it as a figure or a metaphor of the relationship between God and humanity. And then in the case of funerals, Jesus was raised from the dead in the Christian belief system. So the death is this the sort of, it's the central thing, that's reminding us that there's life can be pretty sucky here, and we can do things wrong, and of course we die in the end. But God came into the world and died just like we do, and opens up a doorway to something bigger, like this world is university, and there's a whole world to live beyond this. And so I think of them more as like, from the Christian tradition, is like the ceremonies are just an attempt to kind of reinforce the Christian worldview. And because a lot of the people there, tend to be in agreement with it historically, so that's the goal, that's the role of it. It's like catechizing or something like that.
Yeah, and of course,
but is that true in the atheist? Does that parallel in the atheist funerals and weddings? Is it like an opportunity to reinforce the whatever you want to call it, a non-belief system or a humanitarian secular worldview or something, or is that really not?
I would say no. I should point out too that statistically, atheists get divorced at a far lower rate than religious people do. So, for what it's worth, But
I was just talking to John about the historical ceremonies, not the way people have actually behaved, particularly.
Well, now it is true that you go to a Christian funeral, and they'll say, Christian wedding. And there'll be a lot of talk about how marriage is an institute, founded by God, and that Christ is the head of the household, and all that stuff. Which, that they're definitely propagating their belief system. But in all the weddings and the one funeral that I did, I never went around saying, we believe that this is the one life that we have, and that when we die, we're dust. So live it up. There was none of that. It was just in the moment. These are two people who love each other. They're declaring their commitment to each other publicly, and we here are, as family and friends, are declaring our support and love for them. To give them advice or help in any way that we can. It was, it was all very, I don't want to say practical, but there's definitely no preaching, so to speak. I never
I think that's
pluralistic. It was pluralistic, I guess you'd say.
I think that's probably, not having John's experience with these things, although at least not from the funeral perspective. I think that probably is a good contrast, Bill, and maybe that's what annoyed me so much at a funeral I had to go to recently, where it doesn't annoy me as much at Christian weddings, is it kind of the sermonette, or really just sermon given at the funeral, kind of took away. It had nothing to do with her, the person who died. It was very just like, okay, we're going to use this opportunity to, preach, and you can handle a little bit of it because it's like, oh well, this just gives Christians hope. That's fine, but it really does become sort of a you know, I don't know that it has to be entwined with, basically a sermon about, basically preaching the gospel or something. It can be done in a way that sort of keeps the focus on the person, and that was maybe what bothered me. I feel like weddings, maybe just due to the fact that they're weddings, unless it's like unless it's a wedding from a different culture, which can be a lot longer. They just kind of keep to the point and say, okay, we're going to go through these things, and there's a little like invocation to the couple of, like Jesus welcomes you into union or whatever the case may be, but it's very streamlined. And the funeral, at least this particular funeral, it just kind of got off the topic of the let's celebrate this person's life and went into something else, and that I think that was the part that I just felt was unnecessary. So
I wonder if because historically the weddings and funerals were conducted in churches or within a chapel or so, they were basically within the Christian community, right? That's the way it would be viewed. You're going because it's a church leader presiding over it, and the community there are the Christian community. So it was just sort of assumed to be reinforcing. But maybe I don't know when this started, but as the West has secularized over the last 150, 200 years, I wonder if then that's changed with the mindset of the Christian leaders to be like, hey, we've got the outside world coming in, let's hit them with the gospel, which is maybe something kind of a newer way of looking at it. And of course, a lot of young people's weddings now who are Christians are very non-traditional, and it's a lot of the traditional ceremony is lost completely on a lot of even within churches and stuff. So
you probably get Christian churches that take that in either direction, right? One, the one I was at, very much exactly what you said. Let's just basically preach the gospel. Others, maybe let's not offend anybody or go too far, and let's try to be very welcoming and sort of inclusive. So for sure, but I do think that sounds like it's probably just a completely a point of contrast between the traditional religious wedding and then sort of a secular humanist wedding.
Yeah.
Hey, John, I saw at the American Atheist Convention last spring there were 3 different booths for, I would say euthanasia, but I don't know if there's a better term now for this. But they were basically euthanasia.
Assisted suicide
organizations, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sorry, assisted suicide, I guess is the term. And so it really struck me that there were for a convention of 1,000 people, I thought that's quite a few assisted suicide organizations, And and I happened to interview somebody that I asked them, and I told them they don't need to tell me their personal situation, but then they just ended up right away, telling me in the interview, even though we were doing a recording. It's it wasn't a podcast for The Divide, but it was just for what I do on the side on the iPub YouTube channel. And he just started telling me flat out, that he's starting to plan his death. And I was thinking that might become a lot more common for all sorts of reasons we don't want to go into. But I'm wondering if that's going to change the way people think of funerals, because is some of this going to be done while a person's sort of alive or about to die or something, as opposed to, by the way, there's 11, I think, 10 or 11 states that allow for assisted suicide, but they're trying to push for more. And I think you have to have a terminal diagnosis to within 6 months, I think they told me. But anyway, that I don't know if that'll loosen, those rules will loosen or whatever. But it just made me think if that's something you're seeing in the atheist communities as well, in the organizations you've been a part of, is that more common now?
It's funny that I think that may just be the people that are activists in this particular area see the secular community as being more receptive, and so they come and set up a booth. But I have rarely had any deep discussion with anybody about how they're planning their death or any of that sort of thing. Although it is common for me to hear people say, both religious people and non-religious people, to say that they think it's ridiculous that somebody can't be allowed to relieve their own suffering. If they, it's it's funny that the people who are opposed to assisted suicide inevitably end up doing so for religious reasons. I mean, I think everybody who, a secular person, says, yes, of course, you don't want somebody to just be running around with a syringe full of poison and stab people in the nursing home at random. You want to have a system, a set of protocols, some discipline to it, so that you know for sure that the person who wants to end their suffering they know what they're talking about, that it's reasonable, that they're not just suffering from a momentary depression, et cetera, et cetera. So, I have not noticed any great upswell of, yearning for assisted suicide in the secular community. One thing
it
I
was
did.
a huge controversy. The Dr. Death, do you remember him?
Certainly.
Called him Dr. Death, Kevorkian.
Yeah.
That was a huge controversy. I'm not sure it would have this. I'm not, like many things, I'm not sure if it would have the same, if it has the same stigma, or will continue to. It might loosen. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure, but one thing I did want to mention was
that answers it.
Yeah, talking about the wedding officiant thing. One of the most interesting aspects of doing these secular weddings was when I started actually having to write scripts for these weddings, is realizing how deeply embedded into the public consciousness the religious aspects of the wedding ceremony, how deep they are. For example, you're writing this out, and you always think in your mind about the wedding in the movies where they'll say, "I now pronounce you man and wife. You may now kiss your bride," and there's not going to be any of that in a secular wedding. So you either say, I now declare you husband and wife, and you don't say you may kiss the bride. You simply say to them, you may now kiss, or something like that. You have to be careful. And of course, I've had several joking conversations with people where they'll say, well, you're not going to put the thing about obey in there, are you? I'm like, no, that's not going to be in. I mean, if you want it in there, you can have it in there, but no, that's not going to be in there. And of course, it gets even more creative because I have done some gay weddings. So you can't say, I now declare you husband and wife. You have to say husband and husband seems a little odd, or to say wife and wife seems a little odd. So, and I always ask, some couples, they change their surname. One person will change to the other person's surname, or they'll come up with a new surname. They're going to adopt a different name for both of them, or they're not going to, whatever it is. So, I've done secular weddings where I'll say, I now present to you Mr. and Mrs. John Smith, because that's what they wanted. She wanted to change her name to his last name. Or I'll say, John and Jane Smith, or, that kind of thing. So it gets a little weird. You have to kind of think about how to make it sound nice and smooth, and ceremonial without mimicking too much the sort of traditional chauvinistic aspects of the wedding ceremony.
I'd be trying to make sure I didn't sound like the guy in Princess Bride as well.
Yeah, you do it. Yeah, I did a
Billy Crystal, right?
Yeah,
wasn't it Billy Crystal?
I did one that was the reception was going to be Star Wars themed. So we worked in a Live Long and Prosper. It was Star Trek themed. Anyway, so we had to work something in there.
Isn't it something like Live Long and Prosper?
Well, that's a Star Trek.
Star Trek.
That's Star
Oh, that's Star
Trek.
Trek. Sorry.
Yeah.
What did I say? Star Wars? Yeah, Star Trek, of course.
But anyway, I've done weddings on a beach. I've done weddings in at a vineyard, a science museum.
They're now like all. It wouldn't even really matter the religious background now. They're all. It's really popular to have them out in nature and stuff.
Backyards.
So many lots. I still have lots of questions. I'm sure you do too, Drew, but I think it's a good time to wrap it up.
Okay.
And really appreciated talking to you, John. You said you had a podcast again, which was called...
Yeah, it's American Free Thought. You can go to AmericanFreeThought.com, or you can just search for American Free Thought in whatever pod streaming thing that you do. It's been going since 2007, so there's 350 something episodes at this point.
Wow.
And we've talked to everybody from Neil deGrasse Tyson. Now that I've said, I never talked to Richard Dawkins, but a number of famous people in the in the secular and atheist world. But yeah, there's plenty to listen to. All the episodes are still available, going way back, so you can listen to our embarrassing early episodes, as well as the slightly smoother.
Podcast first started.
Yeah, it was amazing how little podcasting was going on when we started. But anyway, yeah. It's AmericanFreeThought.com.
Awesome. Great. John, thank you so much for being here. Really enjoyed talking to you.
I appreciate it, John.
And,
it's been fun.
I'm Bill the Christian.
And I'm Drew the Skeptic. Thanks for listening.
The Divide is produced by Alan and Ben Hawbrooks and edited by John Workman. Dalton Reed handles IT. Join us for further discussion on this topic at our subreddit, The Divide by iPub. To learn more about other episodes and who we are, check out ipub.org/thedivide. See you next time on The Divide.